My name is Sarah Martinez, and I never thought my father's funeral would become the most confusing day of my life. The October morning in Denver was crisp, with golden leaves dancing in the wind outside St. Mary's Cathedral. I had spent weeks planning every detail of Dad's memorial service, making sure everything was perfect for the man who had been my hero for 28 years. The cathedral was packed. Dad had been a beloved high school principal for over 30 years, and it seemed like half the city had come to pay their respects. I stood near the entrance, greeting guests and accepting condolences, when I noticed him, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple black suit that looked well-worn but clean. "Excuse me," I said, approaching him with my guest list. "I'm Sarah, David's daughter. I don't believe we've met." The man's face softened, and for a moment, I saw something that looked like pain flash across his features. "I'm Marcus," he said quietly. "Marcus Thompson. I knew your father a long time ago." I scanned my list quickly. No Marcus Thompson. The funeral director had been very clear about capacity limits, and we'd had to turn away several people who hadn't RSVP'd. "I'm sorry, but I don't see your name on the guest list. Are you sure you registered?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping. "I didn't register, Sarah. I probably should have called, but I only heard about David's passing yesterday. I drove straight here from Phoenix." "Phoenix?" I felt my chest tighten. Dad had never mentioned anyone from Phoenix. "How did you know my father?" Before Marcus could answer, my Aunt Linda appeared at my elbow. "Sarah, honey, we need to start soon. The pastor is ready." I looked back at Marcus, torn between my duties as host and my growing curiosity about this stranger. "I'm sorry, but without being on the list." "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father's middle name was Eugene. He was named after his grandfather, who immigrated from Ireland in 1932. David used to tell people it was after Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, because he was embarrassed about the real story." My mouth went dry. Dad had indeed been named David Eugene Martinez, and he had always lied about the Eugene part. It was a family secret, one that only our immediate family knew. Even my closest friends didn't know Dad's middle name or the story behind it. "How do you know that?" I whispered. Marcus's eyes filled with unshed tears, because he told me that story when we were 17 years old, sitting on the roof of his childhood home in Aurora, sharing a bottle of his father's beer and talking about all the things we were going to do when we grew up. The cathedral bells began to chime, signaling the start of the service. I looked at Marcus, my mind racing. This man knew something about my father that I'd never heard before. Dad had lived in Aurora as a teenager. That much was true. But he'd never mentioned any close friends from that time. "I need to go," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "But can you stay after? I'd like to talk to you." Marcus nodded solemnly. "Of course, I'll wait in the back." As I walked toward the front of the cathedral, my legs felt unsteady. The service passed in a blur of hymns, prayers, and eulogies. I delivered the speech I'd prepared, talking about Dad's dedication to education, his love for his students, and his unwavering support for our family. But throughout the entire ceremony, I found myself glancing back at Marcus, who sat quietly in the last pew, his head bowed. After the service, as people filed out offering final condolences, I approached Marcus. He was standing by a stained glass window, the colored light casting gentle patterns across his face. "Thank you for staying," I said. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "Your father would have been proud of that service. You spoke beautifully about him." "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. How well did you really know my father?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the last few mourners leave the cathedral. "Sarah, your father was my best friend. We were inseparable from age 15 until we graduated high school. We had plans to go to college together, to be each other's best men at our weddings. We were going to name our kids after each other. Then why have I never heard of you?" The question came out harsher than I intended. Marcus flinched as if I'd struck him. "Because 30 years ago, your father and I had a fight. A terrible, stupid fight about something that seems ridiculous now. We both said things we couldn't take back, and we were too proud to apologize. I left for Arizona, and he stayed here in Colorado. We never spoke again." "What was the fight about?" "A girl," Marcus said simply. "Her name was Jennifer Walsh. We both loved her, and she chose him. I was young and jealous and said some horrible things. I accused him of betraying our friendship, of going behind my back. The truth was, I was just hurt and scared of losing the two most important people in my life. The cathedral was empty now except for us and the maintenance staff beginning to clean up. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger that this man had hurt my father, curiosity about this hidden chapter of Dad's life, and something that might have been sympathy. Did he marry her? Jennifer? Marcus shook his head. No. They dated for about a year after graduation, but it didn't work out. Your father met your mother in college, didn't he? At Colorado State? I nodded, surprised by how much he knew about our family. I've kept track of him over the years, Marcus admitted. Not in a creepy way, but David was important to me. I knew when he became a principal, when he got married, when you were born. I even knew about his diagnosis. His diagnosis? My blood ran cold. What diagnosis? Marcus's face went pale. Oh God, Sarah. I assumed you knew. The cancer. I thought that's why. What cancer? My voice came out as a strangled whisper. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I thought your family knew. I have a friend who works at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital. She mentioned that David Martinez was receiving treatment there. I thought. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Dad had died of a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. There had been no mention of cancer, no signs of illness, no treatments. The doctors had said his heart simply gave out. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice shaky. Dad died of a heart attack. He wasn't sick. He was healthy, active, coaching the school's basketball team right up until… Sarah, sit down, Marcus said gently, guiding me to a nearby pew. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure that's what happened? I tried to think back to that terrible morning 3 weeks ago. Dad had been getting ready for work, making his usual cup of coffee and reading the Denver Post. Mom had been in the shower. I had been at my apartment across town when the call came. Mom found him collapsed in the kitchen, I said slowly. The paramedics said it was a massive heart attack, quick and painless. That's what they told us. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Sarah, I might be wrong. It might have been a different David Martinez. It's a common name. But even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it. And suddenly, I was remembering things that hadn't seemed important before. Dad's frequent doctor's appointments that he'd been vague about. His sudden interest in organizing his papers and finances. The way he'd been hugging me longer at our weekly dinners, as if he was trying to memorize the feeling. I need to go, I said, standing up abruptly. I need to talk to my mother. Sarah, wait. Marcus pulled out his wallet and handed me a business card. I'm staying at the Hampton Inn downtown until tomorrow. If you want to talk more about your father or anything else, please call me. I have stories about him that I think you might want to hear. I took the card without looking at it. Why now? Why did you come to the funeral if you two hadn't spoken in 30 years? Marcus's eyes filled with tears again. Because I've regretted that fight every single day since it happened. Because I've wanted to apologize for 3 decades, but was too proud and too afraid. Because when I heard he was gone, I realized I'd lost my last chance to tell him I was sorry, and that I never stopped considering him my best friend. I left the cathedral in a daze, my mind spinning with questions. The drive to my childhood home took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Mom was in the kitchen when I arrived, surrounded by casserole dishes and flower arrangements from well-meaning neighbors. Mom, we need to talk. She looked up from the sympathy cards she was sorting. Of course, honey. How are you holding up? Mom, was Dad sick? The question hung in the air between us. I watched as my mother's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, and finally, resignation. Sarah, sit down. Oh God, he wasn't he? He was sick and you didn't tell me. Mom's hands shook as she set down the cards. Your father made me promise. He didn't want you to worry, didn't want you to see him as anything other than strong and healthy. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. 8 months? Mom, how could you not tell me? Because he begged me not to. Because he wanted to fight it quietly, without putting that burden on you. Because he hoped he could beat it, and you'd never have to know. I felt like I was drowning. The heart attack was caused by the stress on his body from the chemotherapy. The doctors said it was a common complication. His heart just couldn't handle the strain anymore. I thought about all the times over the past 8 months when I'd called Dad and he'd sounded tired, all the family dinners where he'd barely touched his food, all the moments when I'd caught him staring off into space with a sad expression. I could have helped, I whispered. I could have been there for him. You were there for him, Mom said firmly. Every week, every phone call, every shared meal. You were his joy, Sarah. Protecting you from this was one of the last things he could do as your father. I cried then, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. Mom held me like she had when I was a child, stroking my hair and murmuring comforting words. But I wasn't just crying for Dad's death anymore. I was crying for the months of struggle I hadn't known about, for the burden he'd carried alone, for the father who'd loved me so much he'd hidden his pain to spare me from mine. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the posters and trophies of my teenage years. Mom had insisted I stay the night, and I'd been too emotionally exhausted to argue. The October sun was streaming through the windows, and for a moment, I forgot why I felt so heavy inside. Then it all came rushing back. The funeral, Marcus, the cancer diagnosis I'd never known about. I found Mom in the kitchen, making pancakes. It was something she did when she was stressed, falling back on the comfort routines of motherhood. "Morning, honey," she said, not turning around from the stove. "How did you sleep?" "Terribly," I admitted. "Mom, I need to ask you about something else." She tensed slightly. "What is it? Did Dad ever mention someone named Marcus Thompson?" Mom's spatula clattered to the floor. She bent to pick it up, taking longer than necessary. "Where did you hear that name?" "He came to the funeral yesterday. He said he and Dad were best friends in high school." Mom turned around, her face pale. "Marcus was at the funeral? You do know him?" "I know of him." Mom sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Your father talked about him sometimes, especially when he'd been drinking. He always said it was one of his biggest regrets. The fight they had? So Marcus told you about that." Mom poured herself a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "Your father loved Marcus like a brother. They were inseparable. David used to say that losing Marcus was like losing a part of himself. Then why didn't he ever try to reconnect? Pride, mostly, and fear. Your father was terrified that Marcus would reject him again. He'd rather live with the regret than risk another rejection." I thought about Marcus's weathered face, the pain in his eyes when he talked about Dad. I think Marcus felt the same way. Probably. Mom stared into her coffee. "Sarah, there's something else you should know. Marcus tried to contact your father once, about 10 years ago. What happened? He called the school. Your father was in a meeting and the secretary took a message. But when David saw the name on the message slip, he just stared at it for about 5 minutes, then crumpled it up and threw it away." "He threw it away?" "He was scared, Sarah. Scared that too much time had passed, that they'd both changed too much. He regretted it immediately, but by then it was too late. He'd already thrown away the phone number." I felt a surge of frustration at both men. Two stubborn friends who'd wasted 30 years because they were too proud to pick up the phone. "Mom, I'm going to call Marcus. He's staying at the Hampton Inn." "Sarah, honey, maybe it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." "No, Mom. Dad's gone. I can't change that. But maybe I can understand him better. Maybe I can learn about the parts of his life he never shared with us." An hour later, I was sitting in the hotel lobby of the Hampton Inn, waiting for Marcus to come down from his room. The lobby was generic and sterile, with beige furniture and fake plants, but I was too nervous to care about the decor. Marcus appeared at the elevator, looking like he'd slept about as well as I had. He spotted me immediately and approached with hesitant steps. "Sarah, I'm glad you called. How are you doing?" "I'm okay," I lied. "I talked to my mother. She told me about Dad's cancer." Marcus's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have assumed you knew. I should have been more careful." "It's okay. I needed to know the truth." I gestured to the empty chairs nearby. "Can we sit? I have a lot of questions." For the next 2 hours, Marcus told me stories about my father that I'd never heard. He talked about their adventures, sneaking out to go fishing at dawn, building a treehouse in the vacant lot behind Marcus's house, starting a short-lived band called the Garage Heroes, despite neither of them knowing how to play instruments. "Your father was the funniest person I'd ever met," Marcus said, his eyes lighting up with memory. "He could make anyone laugh. Even Mrs. Henderson, our terrifying algebra teacher, used to crack up at his jokes. I never really saw that side of him, I admitted. He was always so serious, so focused on being responsible. That's because he grew up. We all did. But when we were kids, David was the one who came up with all the crazy schemes. I was the cautious one, if you can believe that. I found it hard to imagine my methodical, organized father as the class clown. What changed him? Life, I guess. His father died when he was 22, and suddenly he had to be the man of the family. He had to support his mother and younger sister. That kind of responsibility changes you. I never knew Grandpa Miguel very well. Dad hardly ever talked about him. Miguel was a good man, but he struggled with depression. Back then, people didn't talk about mental health the way they do now. David was terrified of ending up like his father, not because Miguel was a bad person, but because David saw how the sadness consumed him. I thought about my father's relentless positivity, his determination to see the good in every situation. I'd always admired that quality, but now I wondered if it had been born out of fear rather than natural optimism. Tell me about the fight, I said. The real story. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. It's not a story that makes either of us look good. I still want to hear it. Jennifer Walsh was beautiful, smart, and kind. She was also the first girl who ever paid attention to either of us. Your father and I both developed crushes on her junior year, but we made a pact that neither of us would ask her out unless the other one was okay with it. But someone broke the pact. Your father did. He asked her to prom without telling me first. I found out when I saw them together at lunch one day, holding hands and looking happy. I felt betrayed, like our friendship meant nothing to him. So you confronted him? I did, but not privately. I made a scene in front of half the school. I accused him of being a liar and a bad friend. I said some really cruel things about Jennifer, called her names that I'm still ashamed of 30 years later. I cringed, imagining the teenage drama playing out in the hallways of my father's high school. What did Dad say? He said he was going to ask me for permission, but Jennifer had asked him first. He said he'd been trying to find the right time to talk to me about it. And you know what? I think he was telling the truth, but I was so hurt and angry that I couldn't hear it. So you both just never spoke again? We tried once, about a week before graduation. David came to my house and tried to apologize, but I was still so bitter that I told him I never wanted to see him again. I said some things that I knew would hurt him, things about his father's depression and his family's financial struggles. I was deliberately cruel. Marcus's voice broke on the last sentence. The look on his face when I said those things, I've never forgotten it. He just nodded and walked away, and that was the last time I ever saw him. Until yesterday. Until yesterday. Marcus wiped his eyes. I moved to Arizona a month later. I was supposed to go to Colorado State with David, but I couldn't face the possibility of running into him. I went to Arizona State instead, met my wife there, started a construction business, had kids. But not a day went by that I didn't think about that fight and wish I could take it back. Did you ever try to contact him again? Besides the phone call 10 years ago? I wrote him letters, dozens of them over the years, but I never sent them. I kept telling myself I'd do it tomorrow, next month, next year. I always found an excuse to wait. I thought about the box of unsent letters in my apartment, notes to old friends, apologies to former boyfriends, thank you cards I'd never mailed. We all had things we meant to say, but never did. Marcus, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you regret not marrying Jennifer? Marcus smiled sadly. Jennifer and I went out a few times after David and I stopped talking, but it wasn't the same. I think we both knew that our relationship was built on the wreckage of a friendship, and that's not a good foundation for love. She ended up marrying a guy from her college, and from what I hear, they're very happy. And you? I married my college sweetheart, Ruth. We were together for 25 years before she passed from breast cancer 3 years ago. She was the love of my life, and I never regretted marrying her. But I always regretted losing David. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching hotel guests come and go in the lobby. I felt like I was getting to know a completely different version of my father, not the serious, responsible man who'd raised me, but the funny, impulsive teenager who'd made mistakes and paid for them. What do you do now? I asked. In Phoenix? I'm mostly retired. I still do some consulting work for construction projects, but I spend most of my time volunteering at a literacy center. Ruth was a teacher, and after she died, I wanted to do something that would honor her memory. Dad would have liked that. He always said that education was the most important gift you could give someone. He was right about that. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. "Sarah, I brought something for you. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you, but after talking to you, I think you should have it." I took the envelope, which was yellowed with age, and had my father's name written on it in careful handwriting. "What is it?" "It's the last letter I wrote to him. I finished it about a month ago when I heard about his diagnosis. I was finally going to send it." My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The letter was written on simple notebook paper, the kind Marcus probably used for work notes. "Dear David, I don't know if you'll read this or if you'll just throw it away like you probably should. I don't know if you'll remember me or if you'll want to remember me. But I heard that you're sick, and I can't let you leave this world without knowing how sorry I am. I've been carrying the weight of our fight for 30 years. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about what I said to you, how I hurt you, how I threw away the best friendship I ever had because I was too proud and too scared to admit I was wrong. You were right about Jennifer. You were right about everything. You were trying to be a good friend, and I was too selfish to see it. I was jealous and insecure, and I took it out on you because you were safe, because I knew you loved me enough to forgive me, even if I didn't deserve it. But I never gave you the chance to forgive me, did I? I ran away instead. I've been running away from that conversation for 3 decades. I heard that you became a teacher, then a principal. I heard that you got married and had a daughter. I heard that you've spent your life helping kids and making a difference in the world. I'm not surprised. Even at 17, you were the best person I knew. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to write back or call or want to see me. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry and that I've missed you every single day since our fight. I hope you beat this, David. I hope you have many more years to spend with your family and your students. But if you don't, I want you to know that you were loved by someone who was too stupid to tell you so. Your friend, if you'll still have me, Marcus." I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face. When I finished, I looked up to find Marcus watching me with anxious eyes. "He would have wanted to read this," I said. "He would have called you." "You think so?" "I know so. Mom told me that Dad regretted the fight every day. He was just as scared as you were." Marcus began to cry then, quiet tears that he wiped away with the back of his hand. "I waited too long, didn't I? I waited until it was too late. Marcus, can I ask you a favor?" "Anything." "Will you tell me more stories about my father? About who he was before he became my dad? I feel like I only knew half of him." Marcus's face lit up. "I would love that. I have 30 years worth of stories to tell." Over the next few hours, Marcus painted a picture of my father that was both familiar and completely foreign. We moved from the hotel lobby to a small cafe downtown where Marcus ordered black coffee and apple pie. "Just like your father used to," he said, and continued sharing memories. "Your father was brave in ways that most people never saw," Marcus said, cutting into his pie. "When we were juniors, there was this kid named Danny Reeves who was being bullied by some seniors. Danny was small, quiet, wore thick glasses, an easy target. One day, David saw 3 football players cornering Danny by the lockers, and he just walked right up to them. What did he do? He stood between them and Danny and said, 'Why don't you pick on someone your own size?' Classic line. But the thing is, David was about half the size of these guys. They could have destroyed him. Did they? No, because David was smart. He didn't try to fight them. Instead, he started asking them questions about their math homework, offering to help them study. He knew that 2 of them were failing algebra and needed to pass to stay on the team. By the end of the conversation, he'd talked them into a study group instead of a fight. I smiled, recognizing the diplomatic approach my father had always taken with difficult parents and students. That sounds like Dad. David always said that the best way to stop a bully was to turn them into a friend. He spent the rest of that year tutoring those football players, and they all passed their classes. One of them, Jake Morrison, even spoke at our graduation about how David had changed his life. I never knew Dad was tutoring kids in high school. He started doing it sophomore year, after his father died. He needed the money. but he also genuinely loved helping people understand things. He had this gift for breaking down complex problems into simple steps. It occurred to me that my father had been preparing for his career as an educator long before he'd ever set foot in a college classroom. The man who'd spent 30 years helping high school students navigate their problems had been doing the same thing since he was 16. "Tell me about his family," I said. I knew my grandmother, but she died when I was 12, and Dad never talked much about his childhood. Marcus's expression grew more serious. David's childhood was complicated. Miguel was a good man, but he struggled with what we'd now call clinical depression. Back then, people just said he was moody or difficult. There were weeks when he couldn't get out of bed, couldn't go to work, couldn't interact with his family. How did Dad handle that? He became the man of the house pretty early. He was cooking dinner for his little sister Maria when he was 13. He was the one who made sure bills got paid, who went to parent-teacher conferences when Miguel couldn't function. Your grandmother, Elena, was working 2 jobs just to keep the family afloat. I thought about the responsibility my father had carried from such a young age. It explained so much about his character, his need to be reliable, his determination to provide stability for our family, his reluctance to show weakness or vulnerability. Is that why he never told me about the cancer? Because he was used to protecting everyone else? Probably. David had been taking care of other people his entire life. I don't think he knew how to let other people take care of him. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lunch crowd begin to fill the cafe. I felt like I was solving a puzzle, putting together pieces of my father's personality that had never quite made sense before. "Marcus, can I ask you something that might be painful?" "Sure." "Do you think Dad was happy? In his life, I mean, with the choices he made." Marcus considered this carefully. "I think your father was fulfilled. He had work that mattered to him, a family he adored, and the respect of his community. That's more than most people get. But was he happy? I think David carried sadness with him his whole life. Not just about our fight, but about his father, about the childhood he never really got to have, about all the responsibility he took on so young. But I also think he found joy in small things, in teaching, in watching you grow up, in the quiet moments with your mother." I thought about my father's laugh, which was always slightly surprised, as if joy was something unexpected that had snuck up on him. I thought about the way he'd light up when talking about his students, or the soft smile that would cross his face when he watched Mom working in her garden. "He was proud of you, you know," Marcus said suddenly. "When I was researching your family online, trying to decide whether to come to the funeral, I found an article in the Denver Post about a Teacher of the Year award your father won. In the interview, he spent more time talking about you than about himself. What did he say? He said that his greatest achievement wasn't any award or recognition, but raising a daughter who was kind, intelligent, and brave enough to follow her dreams. He said that watching you become the person you were meant to be was the greatest joy of his life." I felt fresh tears threatening. I wish I'd known him better. I wish I'd asked more questions about his past, about his dreams, about who he was before he became my dad. "Sarah, can I tell you something? You knew the most important parts of him. You knew his values, his integrity, his capacity for love. The stories I'm telling you are just details. The man who raised you, who supported you, who loved you unconditionally. That was the real David Martinez. But I missed so much. The funny teenager, the loyal friend, the young man who was brave enough to stand up to bullies. You didn't miss it. You just saw it in different ways. Every time your father stood up for a struggling student, that was the same courage he showed with Danny Reeves. Every time he made you laugh at the dinner table, that was the same humor he had as a kid. Every time he put your needs before his own, that was the same protective instinct he'd had since he was 13. I realized Marcus was right. The qualities that had made my father a good friend as a teenager were the same qualities that had made him a good father as an adult. The only difference was the context. "I wish you two had reconciled," I said. "I wish you'd had the chance to be friends again." "Me too. But Sarah, talking to you has helped me understand something. David and I never stopped being friends. We just stopped talking. The love was always there, even when we were too stubborn to acknowledge it." "How do you know?" "Because he kept all the same qualities that made me love him when we were kids. Because he became exactly the kind of man I always knew he would become. Because 30 years later, his daughter has the same kindness and strength that he had. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a sense of connection not just to my father, but to this man who had loved him in a different way than I had, but just as deeply. Marcus, I have an idea. I know this might sound crazy, but would you consider staying in Denver for a few more days? I'd like to show you some of the places that were important to Dad. His school, our house, the places where he spent his adult life. Marcus's eyes brightened. I'd love that. I was dreading going back to Phoenix anyway. The house feels so empty since Ruth died. And I'd like to hear more stories. All of them. I want to know about the band you started, about the treehouse you built, about every adventure you had together. That could take a while. I have time. And Marcus? I think Dad would want us to be friends. I think he'd want his daughter and his best friend to know each other. Marcus reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I think you're right. And Sarah, thank you for giving me this chance. I never thought I'd be able to make amends for what I did to your father, but knowing you has been like getting a piece of him back. As we left the cafe, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The grief was still there, sharp and persistent, but it was accompanied by something else now. A sense of connection to a larger story. A feeling that my father's life had been richer and more complex than I'd ever imagined. Where should we go first? Marcus asked as we walked toward my car. The high school, I said without hesitation. I want to see where you two became friends. Aurora High School was a brick building from the 1960s, surrounded by mature trees and a parking lot that had seen better days. It was a Saturday, so the building was locked, but we could walk around the grounds and peer through windows. That's where we had lunch, Marcus said, pointing to a concrete patio behind the main building. We used to sit at that table in the corner, the one that's still there. David would bring these elaborate sandwiches his mother made, and I'd bring whatever leftover pizza or Chinese food my family had ordered the night before. What did you talk about? Everything. Books, movies, girls, our plans for the future. David wanted to be a teacher even then, but he was worried about the money. His family was struggling financially, and he felt pressure to choose a career that would pay well. What made him decide to stick with teaching? You, actually. When he found out your mother was pregnant, he said he realized that the most important thing he could do was work that made the world a better place for his daughter. He said he'd rather be a poor teacher than a rich person doing something that didn't matter. I felt a lump in my throat. My father had chosen his career partly because of me, because he wanted to create the kind of world he thought I deserved. He was a good teacher, I said. Really good. His students loved him. I'm not surprised. He had a gift for making people feel heard and understood. Even as a teenager, kids would come to him with their problems because they knew he'd listen without judgment. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the neighborhood where my father had grown up. Marcus showed me the vacant lot where they'd built their treehouse, now a small park, the corner store where they'd bought candy with their allowance money, now a trendy coffee shop, and the house where my father had lived until he graduated. The house was a small, two-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The current owners had added a modern security system and updated the landscaping, but the bones of the building were the same. That's David's bedroom window, Marcus said, pointing to a second-story window facing the street. He used to sneak out at night by climbing down that oak tree. We'd meet up and walk to the lake to go fishing at dawn. He never told me he was such a rule breaker. He wasn't really, but he was curious about everything, and he couldn't stand the idea of missing out on an adventure. The fishing trips were his idea, actually. He said the early morning was the only time he felt completely free. I tried to imagine my responsible, rule-following father as a teenager sneaking out to go fishing. It seemed impossible, but Marcus's stories were so detailed and specific that I couldn't doubt them. What happened to the treehouse? It came down in a storm about 15 years ago, but it lasted longer than either of us expected. We built it when we were sophomores, and we had no idea what we were doing. It was basically a death trap. Loose boards, rusty nails, no proper supports. I'm amazed we never fell out of it. What did you do up there? Talked, mostly. Read comic books, planned our futures, complained about our parents. Sometimes we'd just sit in silence, watching the neighborhood. It was our private space, the only place where we could be completely ourselves. As the sun began to set, painting the Denver skyline in shades of orange and pink, I realized that I'd learned more about my father in one day than I had in 28 years of being his daughter. Not because he'd been secretive or dishonest, but because he'd seen his role as my protector, not my friend. He'd shared his values and his love, but not his vulnerabilities or his past mistakes. Marcus, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you think Dad forgave you? In his heart, I mean, even though you never had the chance to apologize. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset. I think David understood that we were just kids when we had that fight. Kids make mistakes, say things they don't mean, hurt people they love. I think he probably forgave me a long time ago, just like I forgave him. Then why didn't either of you ever reach out? Because forgiveness and reconciliation are different things. You can forgive someone in your heart without being ready to risk getting hurt again. And the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to make that first move. I thought about my own life, about the friendships I'd let fade away, the conflicts I'd never resolved, the conversations I'd been too scared or too proud to have. How many Marcus Thompsons were there in my own life? People I'd lost touch with because of misunderstandings or hurt feelings. I don't want to make the same mistakes, I said. I don't want to let pride or fear keep me from the people I care about. That's a good lesson to learn young, Marcus said. It took me 30 years to figure it out. As we drove back toward downtown Denver, I felt a strange sense of completion. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it was no longer the only thing I felt when I thought about my father. Now there was also gratitude for the stories Marcus had shared, for the fuller picture of who my father had been, for the connection I'd found with someone who had known and loved him in a completely different way than I had. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before Dad's death. I called Marcus early and invited him to have breakfast with Mom and me. It was time for the two people who had loved my father most to meet each other. Mom was nervous about the meeting. She spent an hour that morning cleaning the already spotless kitchen and changing her outfit 3 times. What if he blames me? She asked, adjusting her earrings for the 5th time. What if he thinks I kept David from reaching out to him? Mom, he's not going to blame you. He blames himself more than anyone else. When Marcus arrived, carrying a bouquet of flowers and looking almost as nervous as Mom, I watched 2 people who had both loved my father circle each other cautiously, unsure how to navigate this strange new relationship. Mrs. Martinez, Marcus said, offering the flowers. I'm so sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for intruding on your grief. Please, call me Elena, Mom said, accepting the flowers. And you're not intruding. Sarah tells me you have stories about David that I've never heard. Over breakfast, I watched Mom and Marcus discover their shared love for my father. They compared notes about his quirks, the way he organized his closet by color, his habit of humming while he cooked, his inability to throw away any book he'd ever owned. He kept a journal, Mom said suddenly. I found it when I was going through his things. I haven't been able to read it yet, but Marcus, I think there might be entries about you. Marcus's face went pale. Elena, I don't need to read his private thoughts. I don't have a right to that. But maybe you do, Mom said gently. Maybe he wrote things he couldn't say out loud. She left the room and returned with a leather-bound notebook that looked worn from years of use. David started keeping this when he was diagnosed. He said he wanted to record his thoughts and memories in case he didn't have time to share them all. My hands shook as I took the journal. Should I read it out loud? Both Mom and Marcus nodded, though I could see the anxiety in their faces. I flipped through the pages, looking for any mention of Marcus. Most of the entries were about his treatment, his fears about the cancer, his hopes for the future. But near the end, I found what I was looking for. March 15th, I read aloud. Had another round of chemo today. The doctors say I'm responding well, but I can feel my body getting weaker. Elena tries to hide how scared she is, but I know. Sarah still doesn't know about the diagnosis. I want to tell her, but I also want to protect her from this for as long as possible. I turned the page. I've been thinking about Marcus a lot lately. Maybe it's because facing death makes you think about all the relationships you've lost, all the things you wish you'd said. I dream about him sometimes. Not the angry young man who said those horrible things to me, but the boy who was my best friend, who knew me better than anyone else in the world. Marcus was crying now, quiet tears that he didn't try to hide. I've wondered so many times over the years what would have happened if I'd been braver, if I'd reached out to him after the anger faded. Would we have been friends again? Would we have been best men at each other's weddings? Would our kids have grown up together? I looked up at Marcus. Dad wondered the same things you did. I heard that Marcus got married, had children, started a successful business. I'm glad. I always knew he'd do well for himself. He was the smartest person I knew, and the most loyal, until that one terrible day when we were both too young and too proud to handle heartbreak gracefully. Keep reading, Mom said softly. If I don't beat this cancer, I hope someone will tell Marcus that I forgave him a long time ago. I hope someone will tell him that not a day went by that I didn't miss his friendship. I hope someone will tell him that I understood why he was so angry, and that I never stopped considering him my best friend, even when we weren't speaking. Marcus was sobbing now, his shoulders shaking with the force of his emotion. Mom reached across the table and took his hand. I wrote him a letter once, about 5 years ago. I never sent it. I was too scared, too proud, too worried that he wouldn't want to hear from me. But I kept the letter, and I read it sometimes when I miss him most. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to send it. There's a letter? I asked. Mom nodded. I found it in his desk drawer. I didn't read it. It felt too private, but it's addressed to Marcus. She left the room again and returned with an envelope that looked remarkably similar to the one Marcus had shown me the day before. Two men, both carrying the same regret, both too scared to reach out, both writing letters they never sent. Marcus, I said, I think Dad would want you to have this. With trembling hands, Marcus opened the envelope. The letter was written on my father's school letterhead in his careful teacher's handwriting. Dear Marcus, he read aloud, his voice breaking. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. I've been thinking about our fight for 25 years, and I finally understand what really happened that day. He paused, wiping his eyes. We were both scared. Scared of losing each other, scared of growing up, scared of all the changes that were coming. We were 17 years old, and we handled our fear the only way we knew how, by lashing out at the person we trusted most to forgive us. You were right about some things. I should have talked to you before I asked Jennifer to prom. I should have been more honest about my feelings. I should have been a better friend. But Marcus, you were wrong about one thing. You said that our friendship didn't mean anything to me. You were wrong. Our friendship was the most important thing in my life. You were my brother, my best friend, my other half. Losing you was like losing a part of myself. Marcus set the letter down, unable to continue reading. I can't. Sarah, would you... I took the letter and continued reading. I've had a good life, Marcus. I became a teacher, married a wonderful woman, had a daughter who is the light of my life. But there's always been something missing. The friend who knew me best, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, who made me laugh until my sides hurt. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to write back or call or want to see me. I just need you to know that I'm sorry for my part in what happened between us. I'm sorry for not being the friend you deserved. I'm sorry for letting pride and fear keep me from reaching out all these years. If you ever think of me, I hope you'll remember the good times, the fishing trips, the treehouse, the dreams we shared. I hope you'll remember that you were loved by someone who was too stubborn to tell you so. Your friend always, David. The kitchen was silent, except for the sound of 3 people crying. 2 letters written by 2 men who had never stopped loving each other, who had both been too scared to bridge the gap that had grown between them. They were both fools, Mom said finally, her voice thick with tears. 2 stubborn, proud fools who wasted 30 years because they were too scared to pick up the phone. But they never stopped loving each other, I said. Even when they were angry, even when they were hurt, the love was always there. Marcus picked up Dad's letter again, holding it like it was made of glass. Sarah, Elena, I need to tell you something. Yesterday, when I was talking to Sarah about David, I felt closer to him than I had in 30 years. Not because he was gone, but because I was finally able to talk about him with people who loved him too. What do you mean? Mom asked. I mean that maybe it's not too late. Maybe David and I can't reconcile in person, but we can still honor our friendship. We can still be part of each other's lives. I understood what he was saying. You want to be part of our family. If you'll have me. I know I don't have a right to ask, but I've spent 30 years feeling like I'd lost my best friend. Yesterday, I realized I hadn't lost him. I'd just lost touch with him. But his family is still here. His legacy is still here. and maybe I can still be part of that. Mom stood up and walked around the table to where Marcus was sitting. Without a word, she pulled him into a hug. David would want that, she whispered. He'd want his best friend to be part of his family. I joined the hug, and for a moment, we were three people bound together by love for someone who was no longer with us, but who had somehow brought us together anyway. I have an idea, I said. Dad always wanted to visit the Grand Canyon. He talked about it every year but never made the trip. What if we go together? What if we take a piece of him with us and finally give him that adventure he always wanted? Marcus's eyes lit up. You mean scatter his ashes there? Some of them. Mom saved some for the family plot, but we kept some for a special place. I think Dad would love the idea of his best friend and his family taking him on one last adventure. When? Mom asked. Next month? We can plan it properly, make it a real celebration of his life. As we made plans for the trip, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Dad's death. Joy. Not the absence of grief, but joy existing alongside it, proving that love was stronger than loss, that connection was possible even in the face of death. 3 weeks later, we stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon, watching the sun set over one of the most beautiful sights on Earth. Marcus had driven down from Phoenix, and Mom and I had flown in from Denver. We'd spent the day hiking, talking, and sharing more stories about Dad. He would have loved this, Mom said, holding the small urn that contained a portion of Dad's ashes. He would have wanted to hike to the bottom, Marcus said. Even at 58, he would have insisted on doing the whole trail. And he would have packed enough food for an army, I added. Remember how he always over-prepared for everything? We laughed, and it felt good to laugh when talking about Dad. It felt like healing. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, we opened the urn and let the wind carry Dad's ashes into the vastness of the Grand Canyon. It felt like we were giving him the adventure he'd always wanted, the freedom he'd always craved, the peace he'd always deserved. Goodbye, David, Marcus whispered. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for bringing me back to the people who love you. Goodbye, Dad, I said. Thank you for teaching me about love, about courage, about the importance of family. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to forgive, never too late to love, never too late to come home. As we drove back to Flagstaff that evening, I realized that Dad's death had given me something I'd never expected. A new understanding of who he was, a new member of our family, and a new appreciation for the fragility and strength of human connections. Marcus was planning to move back to Denver within the year. He'd decided to sell his house in Phoenix and buy something closer to Mom and me. I've been alone too long, he said. I want to be part of a family again. You already are, I told him. You've been part of our family since the day you showed up at Dad's funeral. You just didn't know it yet. That night, as I lay in my hotel room thinking about everything that had happened since Dad's death, I understood something important. Grief wasn't just about losing someone. It was also about discovering who they really were, about finding the connections they'd left behind, about learning to carry their love forward into the future. I thought about Dad's students, who were probably still telling stories about the teacher who'd believed in them. I thought about Mom, who was learning to navigate life without her partner of 30 years. I thought about Marcus, who was finally coming home after 3 decades of exile. And I thought about myself, who had learned that my father was more complex, more human, and more lovable than I'd ever imagined. He'd been a teenager who'd made mistakes, a young man who'd carried too much responsibility, a friend who'd been too proud to apologize, a father who'd loved too much to burden his family with his fears. He'd been all of those things, and somehow that made him more precious to me, not less. The perfect father I'd thought I'd lost had been replaced by a real human being who'd done his best with the time he'd been given, who'd loved deeply and been loved in return, who'd left behind a legacy of connection and forgiveness that would continue long after he was gone. 6 months later, I stood in the backyard of Mom's house, watching Marcus teach my 4-year-old nephew how to build a birdhouse. Mom was in the kitchen, cooking dinner for what had become our weekly family gathering. The evening air was warm, and the sound of laughter filled the space where Dad's absence had once felt so overwhelming. "Aunt Sarah?" my nephew called out. "Uncle Marcus says Grandpa used to build things too." "That's right, buddy. Grandpa was very good with his hands. Did he build tree houses? I looked at Marcus, who was smiling at the memory. He built the best tree house in the whole neighborhood. Maybe Uncle Marcus will tell you about it sometime. Can we build one too? I think that can be arranged, Marcus said, ruffling the boy's hair. But first, let's finish this birdhouse. Your grandpa would have wanted it done right. As I watched the two of them work together, I felt Dad's presence in a way I hadn't since his death. Not as a ghost or a spirit, but as a living influence, a set of values and memories that continued to shape the people who had loved him. Marcus had kept his promise to become part of our family. He was at every birthday, every holiday, every important moment. He'd filled a space that we hadn't even known was empty, brought stories and laughter and a connection to Dad's past that made our present richer. But more than that, he'd taught me something about the nature of love and loss. He'd shown me that the people we love don't really leave us when they die. They become part of the stories we tell, the traditions we keep, the connections we make with others who loved them too. Dad had been gone for 6 months, but his friendship with Marcus was alive again, carried forward by the family he'd left behind. His values were still being passed down, his love was still being shared, his influence was still being felt. And I understood, finally, that this was what immortality really looked like. Not living forever, but creating connections that outlast death, building relationships that bridge the gap between past and present, loving people so deeply that they become part of your story, even after they're gone. The man who hadn't been on the guest list had turned out to be exactly who we needed him to be. Dad's best friend, our new family member, the keeper of stories we'd never heard, the bridge between who Dad had been and who he'd become. And in finding Marcus, I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for: a deeper understanding of love, loss, and the mysterious ways that the people we're meant to know always find their way into our lives, even when we least expect them. The secret Marcus had known, Dad's middle name and the story behind it, had been just the beginning. The real secret was that love doesn't end with death, that friendship can survive decades of silence, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the people who show up uninvited, carrying pieces of our loved ones that we never knew existed. As the sun set over Denver and Marcus helped my nephew hammer the last nail into the birdhouse, I sent a silent thank you to my father. Thank you for being the kind of man who inspired such loyalty, such love, such enduring friendship. Thank you for leaving behind connections that would outlast your lifetime. Thank you for showing me that the best stories aren't about perfect people, but about real people who love imperfectly, forgive slowly, and find their way back to each other when it matters most. And thank you for sending Marcus to us, even if you couldn't send him to yourself. In the end, that unexpected guest at your funeral became the greatest gift you could have given your family, the chance to know you better, to love you deeper, and to understand that death is not the end of the story, but just the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing saga of human connection.